An obsession for women's undergarments and shoes combined with a thirst for murder. Today we discuss the lust killer Jerry Brudos. Let's open the serial killer file. Jerry Brudos was born in Webster, South Dakota on January 31st, 1939. Being the youngest of two boys, Jerry was neglected at an early age. His mother had desired a daughter. Despite her high hopes, she had instead given birth to Jerry. Completely displeased with welcoming a second son into the family, she belittled and psychologically abused him on a daily basis throughout his childhood. The family moved to several neighborhoods around the Pacific Northwest before making their final move to Salem, Oregon. At a young age, Jerry began to freely explore his sexual interests. Jerry was just 5 years old when he began to indulge in his perpetual fetish for women's shoes after finding a pair of high heels while wandering his local junkyard. Wearing the shoes back home, his mother found him and was enraged. She began scolding him repeatedly until she had no further choice but to dispose of his newly loved possession. This triggered an undying desire to collect women's shoes as well as women's underwear without his family's knowledge. No matter how old the female victim was, he took every chance he could to steal their most intimate belongings. It was speculated that he had attempted to steal the shoes off his first grade teacher's feet and began to steal underwear from women around his neighborhood. Due to the abnormal behavior he displayed as a child his age, Jerry was sent off to mental hospitals for psychotherapy in hopes of eliminating his fetishes. Despite his frequent hospital visits, Jerry's behavior just continued to escalate. Following into his adolescent years, Jerry changed his approach by stalking women in his town. At just the right opportunity, Jerry would knock down his target and begin to strangle the victim until they fell unconscious. He would then steal their shoes and flee from the scene, leaving the victim with no solid evidence pointing towards him. This continued to be his way of getting what he wanted until suffocation no longer satisfied him. At the age of 17, he went on to abduct a young woman and had threatened to stab her to death unless she agreed to follow each of his sexual demands. In fear, the woman was forced to strip naked while Jerry began taking photos of her. His fantasies were abruptly cut short, however, when he was caught and immediately arrested for his actions. Jerry once again underwent psychiatric evaluation and was diagnosed with schizophrenia in Oregon State Hospital in 1956. During his 9-month evaluation, Jerry began to obsess over sexual fantasies that revolved around his pure hatred towards women, specifically his own mother. Despite his record of violence, he was deemed safe enough to continue his high school education and eventually graduated from North Salem High School in 1957. In an attempt at restarting his life, Jerry attended college to become an electronics technician. Within a few years of studying, Jerry began to suppress his fetishes towards women, ultimately keeping himself off the radar from police or doctors for a short amount of time. Once appearing to have his life put together, he met 17-year-old Darcy Metzler. The two instantly connected and began dating. Though Darcy's parents did not approve of the relationship, the two were married just a few months later in 1961. Without hesitation, the two eventually settled down in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon. This is where Darcy began to learn far more than she could have ever imagined about her husband. Upon their move to the suburbs, Jerry began to experience unusual blackouts, which were later accompanied by unsettling migraines. After much realization, Jerry found that suppressing his dark sexual desires only worsened his condition. He found that his only solution was to continue his old habits of breaking into houses in order to collect shoes and underwear from female residents. Without his wife's knowledge, Jerry went on to satisfy his needs. However, this did not subdue his desires in the daytime, as he began making Darcy walk in heels while nude inside of their house as he took pictures. Darcy was open to accepting his interest, but eventually rejected him when he approached her while wearing nothing but women's underwear. Though it was an unusual marriage right from the start, Darcy did eventually give birth to 2 children named Megan and Jason Brudos. Problems began to arise between Jerry and Darcy. The couple were no longer intimate with each other after she entered Jerry's garage workshop and discovered images he had taken of nude women. The workshop was off limits to everyone in the household. The only way family members could reach Jerry when inside was through an intercom system hooked up to the door of the workshop. With a failing marriage, he began looking for alternatives that went above and beyond anything he had ever done to satisfy his sexual demands. On the 26th of January, Jerry met Linda K. Slauson, a 19-year-old saleswoman who went door to door, making a profit on selling encyclopedias. It would unknowingly be her final sale when she made a visit to Jerry's house. Appearing to be interested in Linda's products, Jerry led her into the workshop. Before she could react, Jerry began bludgeoning and strangling Linda to death. He then proceeded to use her body as a model that he would change into women's undergarments. Jerry then went on to remove her feet, which were used to wear various high heels, and her breasts were cut off and used as molds for paperweights. Linda's body was later dumped in a nearby river. It would be another year before Jerry would consider taking another life to satisfy his darkest desires. On November 25, 1968, 23-year-old Jan Susan Whitney was driving back home for the holidays when her car broke down. In need of help, Jan caught the eye of Jerry. Jerry obliged to pull over and help the young woman. However, things took a quick turn for the worse when he began strangling her to death. Before disposing of her, he had sex with the lifeless body in her vehicle before driving it back to his workshop. He continued to sexually violate the body for several days until cutting off both breasts as his own personal trophy. Jan's body was left in the Long Tom River. On March 27, 1969, Jerry struck his third victim, 19-year-old Karen Elena Sprinker, a Portland State University student who was abducted while waiting to meet up with her mother for lunch. She was last seen at the Meyer and Frank parking lot in downtown Salem, Oregon, before she was forced to get into Jerry's car at gunpoint. Karen was driven and taken into the workshop where he forced her to strip naked and wear his collection of women's underwear as he took pictures. Jerry proceeded to rape Karen until he finally hung her from a hook attached to the ceiling. He completed his ritual by violating the corpse, cutting off both breasts, and disposing the body in the same exact river as Jan Whitney. Concern began to arise around Oregon as women were reported missing. Jerry's final known kill would be 19-year-old Linda Dawn Saley, who was out shopping at the Lloyd Center just before she was abducted in the mall parking lot. Killing became a natural routine for Jerry as he would take the same steps in photographing the victims, raping, strangling, and violating the bodies before taking his prized possession from each woman. Linda's body was also placed in the Long Tom River. A local university student tipped police in describing a heavy-set man with light hair and freckles that frequently attempted to communicate and meet up with female students on campus. The bodies of Linda and Karen were both discovered between April and May of 1969. Each body was weighed down with heavy auto parts, which were individually tied with unusual knots. With leads pointing towards Jerry as a prime suspect, police were able to request a search warrant for his house in hopes of catching a break in the investigations. Everything had appeared to be normal until they made their gruesome discovery of women's clothing, barbed wire, rope, and images of victims on display inside of the hidden workshop. Jerry was apprehended on June 3rd on 3 counts of murder. However, he later confessed to all of his murders in detail while interrogated. After interrogation with police, Jerry was able to identify the whereabouts of Jan Whitney's body. She had been tied to a piece of railroad iron nearby in the Willamette River. During the trial, Judge Val Sloper sentenced Jerry to 3 consecutive life sentences. Though he had confessed to the murders, he was not prosecuted for the murder of Linda Slauson, as her remains were never recovered. For the remainder of his life, Jerry served his time in the Oregon State Penitentiary. Darcy filed for divorce in 1970 and legally changed her name. She eventually obtained a court order which prohibited her children from ever visiting or writing their father for safety purposes. Jerry Brudos died in the Oregon State Penitentiary on March 28, 2006 at the age of 67 from liver cancer. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to learn more about serial killers, please be sure to subscribe to my channel so you won't miss an episode. And I will see you next Sunday.